The icy wind howled through the desolate streets of downtown Chicago, its bitter fingers reaching into every crevice, every alley, and every soul that wandered there. It was Christmas Eve, a night traditionally filled with warmth, joy, and the laughter of loved ones. But for some, it was a night of solitude, a cruel reminder of what was missing. Among the shadows of the city, nestled under the overhang of a boarded-up convenience store, sat a man whose life had unraveled into a series of endless freezing nights. His name was Thomas "Tommy" Grayson, though he had not heard anyone call him that in years. At 56, Tommy was a man who bore the scars of a hard life on his weathered face. His once bright blue eyes now carried the weight of loss and regret. The faint lines that had once traced laughter on his face were now trenches of sorrow. He had been an accountant once, with a steady job, a loving wife, and a little girl who adored him. But life, as it often does, had other plans. A cascade of tragedy, a fatal car accident that took his wife and daughter, a battle with alcohol to dull the pain, and the eventual loss of his job and home had left him where he was now, a forgotten shadow in a bustling city. On this particular night, the temperature was merciless, plummeting to a deadly low. Tommy pulled his tattered coat tighter around him, shivering uncontrollably. His fingers, blue and numb, fumbled to strike a match to light a small pile of damp wood he had gathered earlier. The flames sputtered out almost immediately, leaving him in the dark once more. The weight of his existence pressed heavily on him, and for the first time in a long while, Tommy began to pray. Not for food or warmth, but for release. "Just let it end," he murmured, his breath a ghostly mist in the frigid air. As he sat there, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, persistent meowing. At first, he thought he might be imagining it, his mind playing tricks on him in his vulnerable state. But the sound grew louder, closer, until a small shadow emerged from the darkness. It was a cat, a scrappy-looking thing with patches of orange and white fur and striking green eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light of a nearby street lamp. The cat approached him cautiously, its tiny paws crunching in the snow. "Well, hello there," Tommy said hoarsely, his voice cracking from disuse. The cat tilted its head as if studying him before letting out another meow and stepping closer. It was thin, like him, with a coat that spoke of a life lived on the streets. But there was something about the little creature that seemed determined, almost purposeful. Tommy extended a trembling hand, and to his surprise, the cat rubbed its head against his palm. Its fur was cold but soft, a small comfort in the icy night. "What are you doing out here, little one?" "You'll freeze to death," he muttered. The irony of his words was not lost on him. The cat meowed again, more insistently this time, before circling around him and pawing at his coat. It was as if it was urging him to move, to follow. Tommy chuckled bitterly. "What? You want me to go somewhere?" "Sorry, buddy, I've got nowhere to go." But the cat was relentless. It tugged at his sleeve with its teeth, its green eyes fixed on him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Finally, with a sigh, Tommy pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting the movement. All right, lead the way," he said, more to humor the persistent feline than out of any real hope. The cat took off, pausing every few steps to look back and make sure Tommy was following. It led him down an alley, across a deserted street, and finally to the rear entrance of an old church. The building was modest but sturdy, its stained glass windows glowing softly with the light of flickering candles inside. A small sign by the door read, "St. Mary's Shelter. Hot meals and warm beds tonight. All are welcome." Tommy stared at the sign, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't known this place existed. He had walked these streets for months, yet he had never stumbled across this sanctuary. The cat meowed again, breaking his reverie, and nudged his leg as if to say, "Go on." With hesitant steps, Tommy approached the door and pushed it open. Warmth enveloped him instantly, and the smell of soup and freshly baked bread filled his senses. A kind-faced woman in her 60s greeted him. "Come in, dear. You must be freezing," she said, guiding him toward a table. As Tommy sat down, the cat leaped onto his lap, purring loudly. "Is this your cat?" the woman asked, smiling. Tommy shook his head, his eyes filling with tears for the first time in years. "No," he whispered. I think it's the other way around." The warm air of St. Mary's Shelter felt foreign to Tommy, like stepping into a dream he didn't quite belong to. Around him, others gathered at the long communal tables, their laughter and chatter filling the once empty spaces in his heart with a sound he had nearly forgotten: hope. A bowl of steaming chicken noodle soup was placed in front of him by the kind woman, who introduced herself as Sister Margaret. "Eat up, sweetheart. There's plenty more where that came from," she said with a gentle pat on his shoulder. Tommy stared down at the bowl, his fingers trembling as he clutched the spoon. For a moment, the scent of the soup transported him back to another life. To his wife, Susan, humming softly as she stirred a pot of broth on their stove. His little girl, Lily, sitting at the kitchen table, drawing pictures of animals she wanted as pets. "I want a cat, Daddy," she had said once, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Tommy's chest tightened. He hadn't thought about those moments in years, too afraid of the pain they brought. But here he was, with a scrappy little cat curled on his lap, purring as if it had always belonged there. Tommy took his first hesitant sip of the soup. The warmth spread through him, chasing away the cold that had settled deep in his bones. "Thank you," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Sister Margaret, the cat, or whatever force had brought him here tonight. The night passed, and for the first time in months, Tommy slept in a bed. It wasn't much, a narrow cot with a thin blanket, but it felt like luxury compared to the icy concrete he was used to. The cat, whom Sister Margaret had started calling Patch due to its orange and white fur, refused to leave his side. It curled up at the foot of his cot, its rhythmic purring lulling Tommy into a deep, dreamless sleep. By morning, the shelter buzzed with activity. Volunteers handed out fresh clothes, served breakfast, and offered resources to help the homeless get back on their feet. Sister Margaret approached Tommy with a clipboard. "We're offering free health checkups today," she said. "You should take advantage of it." Tommy hesitated. He hadn't seen a doctor in years, and he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what they might say. But Patch meowed insistently, batting at his hand as if urging him to go. All right, Tommy muttered, rolling his eyes. "You're bossy for a stray, you know that?" The clinic was set up in a corner of the church hall. A young doctor with a kind smile and tired eyes introduced herself as Dr. Patel. She took Tommy's vitals, checked his reflexes, and listened to his chest with a stethoscope. "Your blood pressure is high," she said, frowning slightly. "Have you been experiencing any symptoms? Dizziness? Chest pain?" Tommy shrugged. "Sometimes. I figured it was just, well, everything else." Dr. Patel's expression grew more serious. "I'd like to run some blood tests. If you don't mind waiting, we can have the results back within an hour." Tommy nodded, his stomach twisting with unease. He tried to distract himself by playing with Patch, who had taken up residence on his lap once more. The cat's unwavering presence calmed him, though the minutes seemed to drag on endlessly. When Dr. Patel returned, her face was somber. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her tone gentle but firm, "your test results show some concerning abnormalities. It appears you may have early-stage kidney failure. We'll need to confirm with further testing, but it's critical that you get medical treatment as soon as possible." The words hit Tommy like a freight train. Kidney failure? Treatment? How could he possibly afford that when he couldn't even afford a meal? Panic clawed at his chest, and for a moment he felt like he couldn't breathe. Sister Margaret must have noticed his distress because she appeared by his side, her presence steady and reassuring. "One step at a time, Tommy," she said softly. "We'll figure this out together." As the days passed, Tommy remained at St. Mary's, slowly adjusting to the rhythm of life in the shelter. The volunteers worked tirelessly to connect him with resources, but the looming specter of his diagnosis weighed heavily on him. He couldn't stop thinking about what Dr. Patel had said: "It's critical." The nights were the hardest. Alone on his cot, Tommy would stare at the ceiling, his thoughts spiraling into dark places. He thought about how easy it would be to just leave, to slip back into the cold anonymity of the streets. At least there, he wouldn't be a burden to anyone. But every time those thoughts crept in, Patch was there, curling up beside him, pressing his tiny body against Tommy's chest as if to anchor him to the world. "You're a stubborn little thing, aren't you?" Tommy whispered one night, scratching behind Patch's ears. The cat purred loudly in response, its green eyes meeting his with an intensity that was almost unsettling. It was as if Patch understood, as if he was saying, "Not yet." Don't give up. One afternoon, a representative from a local housing program visited the shelter. They were offering temporary accommodations and job placement assistance for individuals looking to rebuild their lives. Sister Margaret encouraged Tommy to apply. "You've got nothing to lose," she said with a warm smile. But Tommy hesitated. "What's the point?" he muttered, his voice thick with defeat. "Even if I get a place, even if I find a job, this thing with my kidneys isn't going away. I'm just delaying the inevitable." Sister Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "Every day we're given as a gift, Tommy. Don't waste it." Her words stayed with him long after she walked away. That night, as Tommy sat on the shelter's front steps with Patch in his lap, he found himself staring up at the stars. He thought about his wife and daughter, about the life he had lost and the one he had found here, however temporary it might be. And he thought about Patch, the little stray who had refused to let him die on Christmas Eve, who had led him to warmth and safety. For the first time in years, Tommy felt the faint stirrings of something he had long since given up on: the desire to live. Winter began to loosen its icy grip on Chicago as January unfolded, though the nights still held a biting chill. For Tommy, each passing day at St. Mary's felt like a second chance, albeit one that came with its share of uncertainty. The warmth of the shelter, the kindness of its staff, and the unwavering companionship of Patch had started to chip away at the walls he'd built around himself. Yet, the shadow of his diagnosis lingered, casting doubt on his every step forward. One gray morning, Sister Margaret approached Tommy during breakfast with a flyer in her hand. "There's a fundraiser event happening at the church this weekend," she said, placing the paper in front of him. "We're raising money for shelter programs, and there's going to be a community job fair too. You should come. Who knows? You might find something that interests you." Tommy glanced at the flyer, his skepticism plain on his face. A job fair? It had been years since he'd even considered the idea of working again. Who would hire a man like him, homeless, sick, and carrying more baggage than he could handle? Still, he couldn't ignore the hopeful look in Sister Margaret's eyes, nor the encouraging nudge from Patch, who pawed at the edge of the table as if seconding her suggestion. "I'll think about it," Tommy mumbled, though he wasn't convinced he'd actually show up. That Friday, the shelter was abuzz with activity as volunteers set up for the fundraiser. Tables were lined with homemade baked goods, crafts, and secondhand items for sale. A stage was erected in one corner where local musicians would perform throughout the day. Beyond that, booths for the job fair began to take shape, manned by representatives from various local businesses and organizations. Tommy lingered in the background, unsure of where he fit into all of this. Patch followed close behind him, weaving between his legs and meowing insistently whenever Tommy seemed to falter. "All right, I get it," Tommy muttered under his breath. "I'll at least look around." As he wandered among the booths, he was surprised to find himself drawn to a table run by a small accounting firm. A sign on the front read, "Hiring entry-level positions, on-the-job training provided." The man behind the table, a balding gentleman with kind eyes, noticed Tommy hesitating and offered him a friendly smile. "Interested in accounting?" the man asked, handing Tommy a pamphlet. "I used to be an accountant," Tommy admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago." "Well, experience is experience," the man replied, his tone upbeat. "We're looking for people who are willing to learn and grow with us. If you've got the background, I'd say you're already ahead of the game. Why don't you fill out an application?" Tommy stared at the clipboard the man handed him, his hands trembling slightly as he took it. It felt surreal, this small glimmer of possibility where he had once seen none. But as he sat down to fill out the form, doubts began to creep in. What if they found out about his health issues? What if he couldn't keep up with the demands of the job? What if he failed? Patch, who had settled at his feet, let out a loud, demanding meow, breaking through Tommy's spiraling thoughts. The cat's green eyes locked onto his, steady and unwavering, as if to say, "You've got this." Tommy took a deep breath and began to write. Later that evening, as the fundraiser wound down, Sister Margaret found Tommy sitting on the church steps, Patch nestled in his lap. "I saw you at the job fair," she said, her voice warm with pride. "How did it go?" "I filled out an application," Tommy replied, stroking Patch's fur absent-mindedly. Not sure they'll call me, though. Sister Margaret smiled. You never know. Sometimes all it takes is one small step. A week later, Tommy received a call from the accounting firm. They wanted to interview him. The news sent a ripple of nervous excitement through him, emotions he hadn't felt in years. But the closer the date of the interview came, the more his fears began to resurface. He didn't have proper clothes for an interview. What if they took one look at him and decided he wasn't worth their time? Sister Margaret, ever perceptive, noticed his growing anxiety. One evening, she handed him a neatly folded set of clothes. A second-hand blazer, a clean white shirt, and a pair of slacks that were only slightly worn. These should fit, she said with a wink. And don't worry, Tommy. They're not hiring your clothes. They're hiring you. The morning of the interview, Tommy stood in front of the shelter's small bathroom mirror, his hands shaking as he adjusted the collar of his shirt. The reflection staring back at him was almost unrecognizable, a far cry from the disheveled, broken man who had stumbled into St. Mary's on Christmas Eve. Patch watched from the edge of the sink, his tail flicking back and forth as if in approval. The interview itself was nerve-wracking, but surprisingly hopeful. The man from the job fair, whose name Tommy learned was Mr. Carlson, seemed genuinely interested in his experience. You've been through some hard times, Mr. Carlson said, his tone sympathetic. But it sounds like you've still got a lot to offer. We'll be in touch. As Tommy left the office, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: optimism. It was fragile and tentative, like the first shoots of grass pushing through the cracks in a sidewalk. But it was there. Patch, who had waited patiently in his carrier during the interview, let out a triumphant meow as they stepped outside. You're my good luck charm, you know that? Tommy said, scratching the cat's chin. Patch purred in response, as if fully aware of his role in Tommy's journey. 2 days later, Tommy received the call. He got the job. For a moment, he was too stunned to speak. When he finally found his voice, it cracked with emotion. Thank you, he said, his eyes filling with tears. Thank you so much. Hanging up the phone, he looked down at Patch, who was sitting on the floor, staring up at him with those piercing green eyes. We did it, Tommy whispered, his voice trembling. We actually did it. Patch meowed softly, rubbing against his leg, and for the first time in years, Tommy allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved this second chance. The first day at the accounting firm was both thrilling and terrifying for Tommy. He arrived early, wearing the same blazer Sister Margaret had given him, his shoes polished to a dull shine. Though he felt out of place in the sleek office, the warmth of Mr. Carlson's greeting eased his nerves. Welcome aboard, Tommy, he said, clapping him on the back. You've got this. Tommy's training was rigorous. The firm's systems were far more advanced than anything he'd used in his old job, and the pace of work was overwhelming at first. He struggled to keep up, his hands shaking slightly as he typed numbers into spreadsheets and tried to recall the old skills that had lain dormant for so long. The thought of failing gnawed at him, but every night when he returned to the small room the shelter had helped him secure, Patch was there, curling up beside him, purring with a steadfastness that seemed to whisper, "Keep going." In the evenings, Tommy would sit at the folding table in his tiny room, poring over manuals and practice problems. Patch would often jump onto the table, batting at the papers as if trying to help. "You're a terrible assistant, you know that?" Tommy would say, but the cat's presence was a comfort, his constant companionship, a reminder that Tommy wasn't alone in this journey. As the weeks turned into months, Tommy began to find his rhythm. The numbers started to make sense again. His fingers moved more confidently over the keyboard, and his co-workers began to treat him not as a charity case, but as one of their own. Slowly, he felt a sense of pride returning, a quiet confidence that he thought he'd lost forever. He even started bringing Patch to the office occasionally, much to the delight of his co-workers. "You weren't kidding when you said this cat saved your life," one of them remarked, scratching Patch behind the ears. "He's a hero." But Tommy's journey was far from over. The specter of his diagnosis still loomed, and the kidney issues Dr. Patel had warned about couldn't be ignored. He was placed on a waiting list for treatment at a community health clinic, but the process was slow, and his condition was beginning to worsen. He often found himself fatigued, his energy drained by the end of the day. Despite this, he pushed forward, driven by the promise of a life he was finally rebuilding. One particularly difficult evening, Tommy sat on his bed with his head in his hands, exhaustion weighing on him like a heavy cloak. Patch jumped onto his lap, nuzzling his chin and purring loudly. "You don't give up, do you?" Tommy murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The cat's green eyes met his, and in that moment, Tommy felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to let his illness take away the life he was fighting so hard to reclaim. Not without a fight. The next morning, he confided in Sister Margaret about his worsening health. She listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "We'll figure this out, Tommy," she said firmly. "You're not alone in this." True to her word, Sister Margaret sprang into action, reaching out to a network of charities and health organizations. Through her efforts, Tommy was connected with a nonprofit that specialized in helping low-income individuals access medical care. Within weeks, he was meeting with a specialist who mapped out a treatment plan. It wasn't going to be easy. Dialysis treatments would be required, and a kidney transplant might be necessary down the line. But for the first time, Tommy felt like there was a path forward. The treatments were grueling, leaving Tommy drained and weak, but he refused to let them derail his progress. He adjusted his work schedule to accommodate his appointments, and his coworkers rallied around him, offering support and encouragement. Even Mr. Carlson went out of his way to check in on him regularly. "You're part of the team, Tommy," he said one day. "We've got your back." Patch, as always, was his constant companion through it all. On the days when Tommy felt like he couldn't go on, Patch would curl up beside him, purring with a steadfastness that seemed to infuse Tommy with the strength he needed to keep going. The cat had become more than a pet. He was a lifeline, a symbol of resilience and hope. One evening, as Tommy sat at his table with Patch sprawled across his lap, he received a phone call that changed everything. It was from the transplant coordinator at the clinic. "Mr. Grayson, we've found a donor match for your kidney transplant," the woman said. "We'd like to schedule the surgery as soon as possible." Tommy's breath caught in his throat. A donor match? It felt too good to be true. For a moment, he couldn't speak, his mind racing with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Thank you," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling. "Thank you so much." The weeks leading up to the surgery were a whirlwind of preparation, paperwork, and emotions. Sister Margaret and the shelter staff were unwavering in their support, arranging for Tommy to stay with a volunteer after the surgery to ensure he had a place to recover. His coworkers even pooled together funds to help cover his expenses during his recovery period. "You're not doing this alone," they told him. "We're with you every step of the way." The surgery itself was a success. Though the recovery process was long and arduous, Tommy faced it with the same determination that had carried him through his darkest days. Patch, of course, was by his side through it all, a small, furry beacon of hope and comfort. As Tommy regained his strength, he began to reflect on how far he had come. Just months ago, he had been a broken man, lost and alone on the freezing streets of Chicago. Now he had a job, a home, and a future that no longer felt out of reach. And at the center of it all was Patch, the little cat who had refused to give up on him, who had led him to warmth and safety on that fateful Christmas Eve. One sunny spring morning, Tommy stood outside St. Mary's shelter, watching as a new group of volunteers unloaded donations. Patch sat at his feet, his tail flicking lazily in the breeze. Sister Margaret approached, a knowing smile on her face. "You've come a long way, Tommy," she said. "I couldn't have done it without you, or him," Tommy replied, glancing down at Patch. "He saved me that night. He saved me in every way that matters." Sister Margaret nodded. "Sometimes God sends us angels in unexpected forms." Tommy crouched down, scratching behind Patch's ears. "Yeah," he said softly, "and this one has 4 paws." Spring had fully arrived in Chicago, and with it came a sense of renewal, not just in the blooming trees and warming air, but in Tommy's life as well. For the first time in years, he felt whole again. His health was steadily improving after the kidney transplant, and he was thriving in his new job. He had even started to dream about the future, something that had once seemed impossible. Patch, as always, remained his steadfast companion, a reminder of the incredible journey they had shared. One Sunday, Tommy returned to St. Mary's shelter, not as a resident, but as a volunteer. He carried a tray of steaming coffee cups to a table where several homeless men sat, their faces weary and worn. "I know how hard it is out there," Tommy said, placing a cup in front of each man. "But I also know it can get better. Sometimes all it takes is a little help, and maybe a friend to guide you." Patch, perched on a nearby chair, let out a loud meow, as if to punctuate Tommy's words. The men laughed, their guarded expressions softening. "Is that your cat?" one of them asked, reaching out to scratch Patch's head. Tommy smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "He's more than just a cat," he replied. "He's my guardian angel." Later that day, as Tommy stood outside the shelter with Patch in his arms, he looked out at the bustling city streets. He thought about the night he had nearly given up, and about the small, scrappy cat who had refused to let him. Life hadn't become perfect, it never was, but it had become something he never thought he'd have again. Meaningful. "You know," Tommy said, stroking Patch's fur as the cat purred contentedly, "you didn't just save me that night. You reminded me that there's always something worth fighting for." Patch looked up at him with those piercing green eyes, as if to say, "I know." Tommy smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "Come on, buddy," he said, cradling the cat closer. "Let's go home." And as they walked away together, a man and his unlikely savior, the world around them seemed just a little brighter, a testament to the power of hope, the resilience of the human spirit, and the quiet miracles that come in the most unexpected forms.